Just for some brief context, it's sort of sadly common wisdom now that economic inequality is staggering and growing. Employee ownership is an important and often overlooked policy tool to address this. There's been relatively little data talking about workers at the individual level to speak to this issue. And today I'm going to present data from the National Longitudinal Survey, which is a panel study of workers throughout their careers. And if anyone wasn't here last year, I presented our first big batch of this research. You can see that at our website, and there's reports out in the lobby. The NLS, as I'll be referring to it, is a large longitudinal study of workers throughout their careers, nearly comprehensive in terms of their work experiences, really a rigorous study that most of the interviews are conducted in person. There's been several cohorts. The cohort that I'm looking at and that we've been looking at is the 1997 one. So those guys were first interviewed when they were 13 to 17, and now we're checking in with them. The latest interviews took place in 2015. Notably, it includes an oversample of workers of color, so this is really kind of one of the few studies where we can look at in depth at workers of color and single moms and things like that. So throughout this, I'll be talking about folks that are employee owners and folks that are not. And this is the key question that I use to determine that important distinction. So in each of these surveys, all the respondents are asked about their current or most recent job and whether or not they have this array of benefits. And one of the benefits is employee stock ownership plans. And so anytime you see the category of employee owners, that means they check this to say they have it. And the non-employee owner column is that they did not check this benefit. So turning to those folks that I had discussed last year, in the 2013 interviews, we see that as we would expect over a course of 2 years since they were interviewed, most are employed, currently working for an employer. But we do see right from the start that employee owners are slightly less likely to be not working. So this is a pattern that we'll see further evidence of throughout the slides, but right from the start, non-employee owners, those without an ESOP, are more likely to be laid off or for some reason not in the workforce over the course of this 2 years. And there's a lot of data here, but just the basic point is we have a very small group of folks who had left their job, and this is just kind of the reasons for that, comparing the two groups. Now, a second slice of this is the folks that we looked at in 2013, the ones that are currently employed now. What's been the churn? What's been happening to those folks? And we see that the non-employee owners have had more employers overall. So there's been more of them kind of coming in, leaving a job, going to another job, having more than one employer in that, and we're talking about 2 years. So we're seeing evidence of this job instability. And further evidence of this, another way to look at it is in terms of job tenure in years. So we're seeing those employee owners have been at their job longer. That's nearly 6 years over this entire time period, over their entire careers up to this point. compared to the non-employee owners. And this comports with what we found last time in 2013, more job stability, and that's going to translate into a bunch of different things as these folks are moving through their careers. And then just to kind of update what we found in 2013. So these are folks again who said yes, either yes or no, I have that employee stock ownership plan, and here's the array of other benefits. And these are notable in so many ways that these folks are more likely to have benefits that will help them build their financial security and not have to dig into their savings for dental benefits, for instance, things like this. So it's another pattern, another slice of evidence that employee owners have more benefits and more ways to kind of be cushioned from financial insecurity. Median wages from income is another thing that we found in 2013 to be quite notable difference between those employee owners and the non-employee owners. And so we see overall they're doing better. And these are only currently employed. Both those groups are currently employed, the comparison groups. And even when we do even when we run kind of tight controls, looking at kind of, okay, even in manufacturing, we see a difference. Even among, across different income categories. And for folks that are kind of on the edge, the difference between 30,000 and 33,000 means a great deal to them, and we'll see that we're going to see patterns of that throughout their careers. So then the next kind of slice of this is to say, okay, so who was in the group where they had employee ownership in 2013 and employee ownership in 2015? And then my comparison group then is those that had it in neither year. So I want to do a check-in to kind of see, okay, are we talking about vastly different folks here, such that we would have there would be some other factor going on to explain the folks that had employee ownership in those 2 years and those that did not. So we do see a gender difference here in those two groups, which I'm definitely going to keep an eye on. And kind of, I think that's going to be an interesting point to dig into in terms of career choices, or where these folks are in terms of building families or turning to part-time, or all different interesting factors. But for the main points here, we're not seeing huge differences in their education, in their parents' education, the kind of things that we would ascribe to, say, there's something else driving the patterns that we're going to see. This is turning to subjective measures. So I'm taking those groups, those that had ESOPs in 2 years, both those years, those that had ESOPs in neither year, and looking at their assessment of their financial condition. And we do see, what I think is quite telling is the folks that we see much more intensity among the people that had ESOP in both years. They're sizably more likely to say they're very comfortable and secure. And from research, we know that the extent and the intensity of economic worries spills out into a bunch of different, from political participation to health, to a bunch of different things factors that are important. And right here we're seeing things that even though the two groups are not startlingly different in terms of their economic condition, employee owners this is empirical evidence that employee owners are more able to take a breath and to feel that they are in a position of some stability. Stay tuned at our website. The NCEO has set up a great website with the findings from my work, as well as just great stories that translate the quantitative data into the voices of workers and their stories. And also stay tuned. The next round of interviews should be posted. I should be able to dig into that in September next year. And I welcome any questions you have about any of the research we do, any of these findings, anything you would find interesting to dig into, as I'm going to continue to dig into these 2015 interviews. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Next, we will have discussant Angelina Grigorieva make some remarks about Nancy's presentation. Angelina is the J. Robert Baster Fellow and Michael W. Huber Fellow at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, as well as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard Center for Population Development.
Thank you very much. Can I speak right now? Okay. Well, hello everyone, I'm Angelina. Thank you very much for the introduction. It is my honor and pleasure to be a discussant on this presentation, not only because this is a very interesting and important work, but also because it is the very first presentation on the very first session of the program. So I feel it's an honor. Do I speak okay? Okay, thank you. So just to give you just to give you an overview of my presentation, I will not give any summary of the presentation because Joseph said so. Instead, I believe that good feedback always emphasizes the strengths of the paper so that the author knows what is really compelling in this, like in her research. And then I also move to suggestions. And for both the strengths of the paper and the suggestions, I discuss them with respect to the framework and motivation for this research, and also with respect to data and analysis. And also, just as a disclaimer, I had access not only to Nancy's presentation, but also to the working paper and report. So in my feedback, I will kind of give feedback both for the presentation, but also occasionally for the paper. Okay, so let's get started. I think that the framework for this research is very strong. So there is no robust evidence on the benefits of employee ownership from company-level research. So, for example, we know that ESOPs are less likely to lay off workers. But how does this translate into individual-level differences in the propensity of being laid off between ESOP and non-ESOP workers? And so in the paper, Nancy emphasizes that the strengths of this research and motivation for this research is that we move from examining employees' outcomes at the company level to examining individual level outcomes. And I think this is a really compelling motivation for this research. So also, most research in the literature focuses on inequalities in earnings and income. And what I really like about this paper is that it focuses on a wider range. What I really like about this paper is that it focuses on a wide range of indicators of economic well-being. And this is because less attention in the literature has been paid to other indicators of well-being other than earned income. And at the same time, we know that other indicators of economic well-being, they matter too. So consider income and wealth, for example. Despite consistently high correlation between income and wealth across various measurement strategies, income and wealth represent conceptually distinct dimensions of economic well-being. So first, income captures a point-in-time measure of the flow of monetary resources, whereas wealth has a cumulative nature because it reflects the stock of financial resources accumulated today. More importantly, wealth continues to be associated with a number of positive benefits and life outcomes even after controlling for income. So for example, net of income, so after taking into account differences in income, we know that wealth is positively related to educational and cognitive achievement, labor market outcomes, family formation, transition to adulthood, and better health and even lower mortality. And finally, wealth is distributed even more unequally than income. And so I think I was really happy to see that you look not only at income, but also wealth and a wide range of other indicators of well-being. And I think this is a very important strength of the paper, that it looks beyond earned income. So another strength of the paper is its use of an existing data set in a novel way. So the analyst-wide data has been around for quite a while, and it has been widely used in sociology, my home discipline. But to be honest, I am not aware of many studies using the analyst-wide data to examine employee ownership. And yet the data has some unique strengths. So first, a strength of the data set, and I think the author should emphasize this a little bit more in the paper, is the size of employee owners in the sample. So it's several hundred cases, so you can easily apply a variety of statistical methods, and that's a national survey. So the data are also nationally representative, and there are not that many nationally representative data sets that ask a series of questions on employee ownership. And also the data track a sample of young workers. So this is an important group because we know that early career experience has lasting implications during the life course. As Nancy, I think, very smartly puts it in the paper, and I'm quoting here, the financial foothold at the start of workers' career has the potential for long-lasting impacts throughout their lives. And finally, the NLSY is not only the only national survey that makes it possible to examine employee ownership, but also, to the best of my knowledge, it is the only panel national data. And as Nancy also mentions in the paper, the panel nature of the data makes it possible to use more sophisticated statistical methods that make it possible to isolate better the association between employee ownership and a variety of outcomes. And I will talk about that a little bit more in my suggestions. And so the paper focuses on a wide range of indicators of well-being, and Nancy shows an impressive array of descriptive results in the presentation and also in the paper itself. And I actually think that some of the interesting results from the paper were not in the presentation. So in the paper, I really like how you show that the disparities in earnings and wealth were barely there at the beginning of the observation period, and then they increased over time. Disparities between employee owners and non-employee owners. And that was a very interesting way to analyze the data by focusing on wage and wealth trajectories of employee owners versus non-employee owners. And finally, I can only applaud Nancy for the presentation of the results. So all the tables and graphs are really easy to understand. And as I mentioned earlier, I really like the graphs, some of the graphs in the paper that show the stark differences between the two groups of workers. And also the writing style is really great. So my understanding that this is not an academic paper targeting academics and researchers, but more of a report targeting a more general audience. And I can only applaud you on the writing style. It was very easy to follow and understand, even for readers who are not researchers of employee ownership or inequality and economic well-being. Well, now that I have flattered Nancy enough, let me move to some suggestions. Okay. So first I have some suggestions for how to frame and motivate this research. So currently the paper is largely motivated around the positive implications of employee ownership. So you start by saying that most research on employee ownership focuses on company-level outcomes, and the contribution of your study is the focus on individual-level outcomes. And as I said, I think this is the strength of the paper, but at the same time, because the paper is largely framed around employee ownership and its positive implications for workers, this framework targets largely researchers of employee ownership. However, this paper is not just about employee ownership and its implications. It is both about employee ownership and economic well-being. And the findings also have implications for inequality. So So I think that an alternative framework to consider is also frame the paper around its focus on well-being. So and your contribution then is the focus on employee ownership as a novel explanation for variation in indicators of well-being. Because there is a large literature on economic well-being and economic inequality, and this literature has largely ignored the role of employee ownership, this way of framing the paper would emphasize the novelty of the findings and would also appeal to a larger audience. I also would like to push you to discuss more in the paper what constitutes economic well-being. As I said earlier, most research in economic well-being and inequality focuses on earned income. And currently the paper just lists all the indicators of economic well-being that it examines. And however, what constitutes economic well-being may not necessarily be obvious to readers. And a skeptical reader might think that earned income captures everything she needs to know. And she might think that a skeptical reader might think that other indicators do not matter as much once income is taken into account. So I think it is important to discuss that various indicators of well-being represent conceptually distinct dimensions of economic well-being. So consider, as I discussed earlier, the example of income and wealth, how they represent distinct indicators of well-being. So overall, I think that the paper would benefit from a more in-depth discussion of what is economic well-being. So I also have some suggestions for the analysis. So first, the paper, I think, would benefit from a discussion of how the fact that ESOP benefits is self-reported in the survey may bias the results. So for instance, if among all ESOP participants, those who are more likely to report that they are in an ESOP have higher education and in general more socioeconomically advantaged, this may bias some of your findings. And one way to address this is to check how respondents in the NBER survey of employees of 14 companies that we are all familiar with, how accurately ESOP employees report their membership in ESOP, because with that data, we know for sure whether they're ESOP members or not. Second, if the propensity to be in an ESOP is not randomly distributed in the population, then some of the associations you pick up between ESOP membership and the economic outcomes may reflect selection into ESOPs. You discuss this a little bit in the paper, and I really like the table in the paper where you show that employee owners and non-employee owners are quite similar on a range of socio-demographic attributes. But I think that another and more statistically rigorous way to address selection would be to use fixed effects models where you would examine within person differences rather than between person differences. I also have two suggestions for analysis. So first, the NLSY is a panel data, and that is a strength because you can analyze panel data in many ways compared to cross-sectional data. First, you can examine how employee owners compare to non-employee owners, and this is what the presentation largely focuses on. However, this type of analysis largely does not make use of the panel nature of the data, and an alternative would be to examine and compare trajectories or changes over time for employee owners compared to non-employee owners. So you do a little bit of that in the paper, for example, when you examine trajectories of income and wealth for these two groups. And these results were not in the presentation, and I would like to push you towards the analysis of trajectories for employee owners versus non-employee owners in order to take advantage of the panel nature of the data. There is also another way to take advantage of the panel nature of the data. So currently the paper divides the sample into employee owners versus non-employee owners. But this distinction does not take into account that membership in ESOPs can change over time. And to take this into account and to take advantage of the panel nature of the data, the sample can be divided into three groups. So the first group are those who are never in ESOPs, throughout the entire observation period. The second group would include those who were in an ESOP at some point during the observation period. And the third group are workers who are in an ESOP throughout the observation period. And currently you divide the sample into those who are never in an ESOP versus those who those who are in an ESOP either at some point or throughout the observation period. And I think an advantage of this measurement strategy that uses three categories is that you would use all the information in the data, and this measurement strategy captures more fine-grained variation. And finally, I would like to make suggestions for additional analysis. So first, the paper focuses on the association between being in an ESOP and the wide range of positive outcomes. But are these associations the same for all group of workers? Or is there a heterogeneity in the association between being in an ESOP and economic well-being? So in other words, do all employee owners benefit from employee ownership in the same way, or do more advantaged benefit more than the less advantaged, or vice versa? And this is an important question if we're interested not only in the implications of employee ownership for individual well-being, but also in the implications of employee ownership for inequality at large. If the benefits of employee ownership are not distributed equally among employee owners, and if some social groups are more likely to be employee owners, then this heterogeneity may have implications for inequality. And one way to address this heterogeneity is to examine differences by race, gender, and class. These are the three most important dimensions of inequality in the United States. And as a sociologist, I see what I'm leaning to call a notable lack of attention to differences by race, gender, and class in the literature on employee ownership. And I would like to use this opportunity to push you towards examining disparities in benefits of employee ownerships by these important social demographic dimensions. And I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelina. Next, we'll have Doug Cruz present Where Does Profit Sharing Work Best? A meta-analysis on the role of unions, cultures, and values.
I was told I should keep my head very still for purposes of live streaming. So you won't see me doing my normal wild gesticulations and gymnastics as I make my presentation. It'll be pretty exhausting. Once upon a time, way back when I was a graduate student, I was working on my dissertation, and I assembled a data set on profit sharing. It was a very strong, powerful data set. It had observations on companies, profit sharing and non-profit sharing companies, data over time. And my main focus for my dissertation was looking at Marty Weitzman's share economy theory. His theory that the widespread adoption of profit sharing would lead to fewer layoffs, lower unemployment, and a stronger economy overall, lower, more mild business cycles and so forth. Well, so I focused on that for my my dissertation, but I was doing a 3-essay dissertation, and I needed another essay. And I thought, well, okay, why don't I look? I use this great data set to look at this quaint old theory that profit sharing may help productivity. I didn't really expect to find positive results. There is this theory that profit sharing can improve, worker cooperation effort, information sharing, and so forth. And economists allow for the possibility that this might happen. Paul Samuelson, who's the first Nobel Prize winner in economics, wrote, "The economist's tool of a production function cannot be defined independently of workers' morale, attitudes, and wage rates. Workers may produce more effectively, may promote the profitability of the firm if they have a sense of financial incentive and profit reward when the corporation flourishes." So the economists allow for that possibility. But my data set really had more large firms in it, and I really thought it's the free rider problem is going to overwhelm any positive effect. And economists always think of the free rider problem, but when you get beyond any small group, it's just impossible for a group incentive to have positive effects. So I honestly did not expect any significant coefficients, but hey, I was finishing up a dissertation. I thought, I'll write up some insignificant results, and I'll get my PhD, and I'll be out of here. But darned if I didn't get some positive and significant coefficients. And I thought, okay, well, that's because I didn't control for this, or I didn't control for that, or I didn't use this technique. But every time I tried something new, the result remained. And I was so puzzled. I developed a grudging respect for this result. My God, here I am trying to beat down this result, and it remains. So I showed this to Marty Weitzman, who is one of my dissertation advisors, and he said, I've seen a number of other studies showing positive relationships here. Let's do a literature review here. And he'd been asked to do a literature review for the Brookings Institution, asked me to participate in that. So we did, but we made it a meta-analysis, which is really a high-tech literature review. Meta-analysis had been used at that point, I think, only in psychology. I think this was the first time it was used in economics, and it got some attention for that reason. Meta-analysis does statistical tests on combined results from many studies. Unlike a standard literature review, what it does is take a quantitative estimate from each study, or several estimates from each study, combine them and do statistical tests on those combined results across the many studies. So we ended up doing our meta-analysis, and we found 16 studies, both published and unpublished studies, and found far more positive, significant results than you would expect if the true result were really zero, that there's no relationship. Several years later, Chris Dikouliagos, took me a long time to learn how to pronounce that, did a similar meta-analysis, a bit more high-tech, and used 19 studies and found similar results, that there was a positive relationship. But neither of those studies controlled for publication selection, model misclassification bias. They did not look at the role of contextual factors. There's been a lot of advance in meta-analysis over the past 20, 25, good Lord, that's been 28 years now. So, we needed a new study. And Chris and Patrice LaRoche were eager to do this, so I was glad to participate. In our current study, we did a wide-ranging search, found 56 studies with sufficient information, had 313 estimates, hard productivity measures. We're not using subjective estimates here, not managers' estimates of we're doing well. We're not using profitability, employment, or other performance measures, just hard productivity measures, typically sales per employee or value added per employee. This is only studies on the effect of profit sharing on its own, not as part of a bundle of interventions. We're not trying to strip out profit sharing from other interventions when profit sharing was measured that way. We are controlling for other interventions, but looking at profit sharing's independent effect, not as part of the bundle. Does not include employee ownership here. We've, of course, done a lot of study on employee ownership, but this study is on profit sharing itself. But we do control for ownership. There's 6 studies of cooperatives, 50 of participatory capitalist firms. The studies cover 18 countries, going from Albania to the USA. USA and UK have more studies than others, but the fact that we have a number of countries here is good, because as you'll see, we end up using some cultural measures, and this geographical dispersion gives us a good chance to see if those cultural measures make a difference. So the method. From each study, constructed a partial correlation for each estimate, reflecting the relationship between profit sharing and productivity, and controlling for other factors. And first I'll present the overall pattern, and then we do something called meta-regression analysis to take account of other factors that were controlled for, publication selection bias, corrections for reverse causality, panel versus cross-sectional data, whether the study was published or unpublished, and other design factors. The basic pattern. The overall weighted average correlation is 0.044. Now, as you might know, the correlations can go between -1 and +1. -1 is a perfect negative correlation, +1 a perfect positive correlation. You can perfectly predict productivity with profit sharing, say. Here, we find a positive 0.044, so it's positive, it's not zero. It is strongly significant positive association. We can reject that it's zero. It's not large. The one thing that really struck me when I saw it is that it's remarkably close to the 0.04 average for employee ownership and productivity from the forthcoming Boyle et al. Meta-analysis. In fact, Ernie O'Boyle presented that meta-analysis in this very room, in this very spot last year. The weighted average, we separated out cooperatives and non-cooperatives. For non-cooperatives, 0.043. For cooperatives, it was larger, 0.266, which is interesting. Maybe profit sharing works better in cooperatives. However, part of that difference reflects different measures of profit sharing in cooperatives. In a lot of the non-cooperatives, the profit sharing is measured by a percent of workers covered or dummy variables for who's covered and who's not. Whereas in cooperatives, it's typically measured using a profit-based measure, profits per bonus per employee or something like that. And in that case, you've got real concerns of reverse causality, because obviously the size of the bonus is going to be related to the productivity of the company. So, this is the only graph I'm going to present. I'm an economist. I have to present at least one graph here. What this is each of those dots represents one of the estimates. And what we would expect is that these estimates cluster around the true value, that if you've got a true value out there you're trying to measure through surveys or whatever, this is just a general feature of social science, that you expect the estimates to cluster around the true value, and that they will cluster around the true value according to a normal distribution, a bell-shaped curve. So you look at this and you say, well, that's kind of bell-shaped, but it's a bit of a lopsided bell. There's more estimates on the right than we would expect. That's a concern. The estimates skewed to the right may indicate some publication selection bias. There aren't enough negative results being published out there. Now, you might say, well, heck, we're getting more positive estimates than we would expect. Isn't that good for profit sharing? That's not the right way to think about it. What's good for profit sharing is that the average is positive. That dotted line in the middle is greater than zero. It's not good for profit sharing that the distribution is not symmetric. We would expect, as I say, the estimates to cluster around, to be evenly distributed around the true value. So, that's a concern. I'll say more about that in a bit. Fortunately, the positive results do survive that concern. Okay. What we did was to take those partial correlations, regress them on the standard error of the estimate to indicate publication selection, whether the study corrected for reverse causality or endogeneity. Obviously, the correlation does not imply causation, and a lot of these studies have done a variety of corrections to figure out, to adjust for any bias there. The region of the study, whether the study was unpublished or not, data differences, year, continuous measures, panel data, variety of things there, use of other controls, decision-making, ownership, physical capital, random effects, fixed effects, all the design features there for the studies. Plus, we looked at 3 moderators. The effectiveness of profit sharing may be affected by unionization. Unions may facilitate or hinder effects of profit sharing. They historically resisted variable pay, but may provide peer pressure, solidarity that discourages shirking and free riding. Trust in others. Profit sharing may work better when workers trust others not to free ride. We measured that by a country level estimate of the proportion, say, cheating on taxes if you have a chance is never justified. I'm from the World Values Survey. I have my own questions about whether that's really measuring trust, but welcome thoughts on that. And individualism. Profit sharing may work better in collectivist cultures where it's easier to resolve collective action problems, but it may be more effective in individualist cultures to help overcome reluctance to cooperate. A bit of foreshadowing there that second thing seems to be very relevant. We measure this using the Hofstede measures of how individualist a country is. So the key results, I'm not going to present a bunch of regression results here, just give you a bullet point on the main results. Publication selection bias is significant, indicating some researchers may selectively report coefficients, but positive results survive this correction. We put some in italics. We're not accusing anyone of anything, but in the publish or perish world, it's harder to publish insignificant coefficients, that seems to be a factor here. The results are more positive in estimates of control for reverse causality. Partial correlation is 0.05. It's over twice as high, which is really interesting. Normally you think that reverse causality would drive that down, but it goes up. Larger samples are more positive estimates. Type of measure and use of panel data is not important. Controlling for employee is not important. So the effects are independent of employee. It's not just reflecting employee. More positive results if controlling for capital stock, firm age and time. Less positive results if controlling for human capital, indicating part of the positive relationship comes from profit sharing having higher quality human capital. The contextual variables show a bigger relationship between profit sharing and productivity in the presence of higher unionization. Greater voice, representation, protection of workers can induce profit sharing to be more effective in increasing productivity. But also we found lower self-reported trust in others and more individualistic attitudes associated with better effects of profit sharing. What gives with the latter two results? It's like a bit puzzling. One would think a predisposition to trust people and to engage in collective action would actually help profit sharing work better. Our interpretation here is that cooperation is productive. It's good when workers work together, and profit sharing may be more effective in inducing cooperation in cultures where cooperation does not naturally occur, where there's more individualism and less trust among workers in general. In other words, cooperation is good, and in cultures that are cooperative to begin with, that's good, that helps productivity, but profit sharing isn't needed there in some sense. Whereas in cultures that are less cooperative, profit sharing may be very useful for that cooperation. We did look at country differences. In the US, the correlation was slightly higher, 106. In the UK, it was lower. And there, the 95% confidence interval includes 0, so that we cannot be 95% sure of a positive relationship in the UK. Who knows what's going on with those Brits? Maybe James Hayden can tell us. But in Germany and Japan, and especially in transition economies, high correlation. Conclusion, profit sharing is linked to higher productivity. It wasn't just my strange experience back in graduate school. That seems to hold up over years, especially when accounting for reverse causality and properly controlling for capital intensity. The effect is somewhat reduced when controlling for human capital, indicating that part of the positive effect comes from higher human capital, possibly from workers being attracted to profit sharing schemes. But there's a dispersion in results, stronger link in the presence of unions, countries where honesty is less highly valued, and there are higher levels of individualism. So implications, a couple of quick implications here. For firms, context is important. Of course, we hear that time and again in the symposium. We may combine with other high-performance policies, employee involvement and so forth, to encourage cooperation in settings where cooperation does not naturally occur. For policymakers, I actually think the most important result here is that profit sharing may help and at the minimum will not hurt economic performance. So if you're interested in profit sharing for other reasons, for social good, for example, Washington and other founding fathers believed it was important for democracy to have broad distribution of ownership and economic rewards, it's important that if there is a social good there, we're not going to have a social, we're not going to have an economic cost to it if we want to promote profit sharing for other reasons. And finally, for researchers, there is still substantial dispersion to be explained, still a lot of work for us to do. A deeper explanation should involve direct measurement of worker behaviors and motivations, as in the study Richard and Joseph and I and Chris Mackin did, where workers in shared capitalism plans were more likely to take action against shirkers, and a large portion said it was because poor performance would cost me or other workers in bonuses stock value. It would be immensely useful to have more such measures of worker attitudes and behavior, including the types of cultural attitudes measured here, to better unlock the question of how and why profit sharing affects productivity. And you can tell that I've got some international co-authors here because I put a U in the last behavior there. Because I gave an international flair to my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, up next we will have Marshall Vance present some. We will have Marshall Vance present some comments on Dr. Cruz's research. Marshall Vance is Joseph Cabral Distinguished Scholar and Fellow, Fidelity Investments Fellow, and Assistant Professor at the University of Michigan School of Business.
Fix my shot. Yes. Okay.
Seems a little bit dangerous to be sitting this close to the person whose paper you're discussing, but I guess actually along those lines, Joseph sent out as Angelina mentioned, a set of guidelines for the discussants, and one of the first points there said, keep in mind that the whole point of the symposium is really to provide mentorship. And so as I think about kind of our relative stature in the field and our relative expertise in the area of profit sharing specifically, it is my pleasure to be mentored as I had the opportunity to read this paper and think about some comments here.
I need mentoring. Seriously.
So I certainly hope that what I provide here will be constructive. I really like the paper a lot. I will, though, focus on those things that I think can be better. I don't know if I would call that mentoring as much as comments from the peanut gallery or something like that. So first of all, what I really like about the paper, and this comes out, I think, more strongly in the title than anywhere else, even compared to the presentation we just had, is I really like this focus on the idea of when does profit sharing work? Taking away or taking a step back from this more broad, and I would say, in some cases, less relevant question of does it work or not? And the reason why I think that's not as relevant, so let me couch that, I think that it is very relevant for policymakers. And if that's your primary audience, then this question of overall, in general, is the average effect positive or not, that's very important. But for me, maybe because my orientation is more on the micro level, if I were a firm considering do I want to adopt this or not, I'm not so concerned about the average effect. I want to know, is this going to work for me? And so knowing, is this going to work, and in what settings is it going to work, I think is really valuable. And so I really applaud that focus. And of course, there is still that focus. And I think in terms of space in the paper, more of the focus is still actually on this average effect. And I'll talk a little bit here, this stated contributions. But I would maybe suggest using the stated contribution of let's look at the average effect in a more sophisticated way than has been done in the past, just kind of first stated contribution. I would use that as motivation, say, look, there is heterogeneity here. We can show that there is this heterogeneity. Now let's see if we can explain it. And so I'm coming to this not as an expert in the meta-analysis methodology. I've seen very, very few of those, particularly in accounting and finance. And so, to me, it was a really cool way to get at this question of where does it matter, especially thinking about the country differences. As Doug mentioned, there is quite a dispersion. And that's really where the strength of the data comes, is you have all these different countries that are represented. And so let's think about some of these country factors. I think that's a really cool use of this meta-analysis methodology, as opposed to, again, just saying, well, on average, over the last 30 years of research, what's the average coefficient there. Okay, so I like the paper a lot. Now let me just give some questions. Some of these questions I think are going to reflect the fact that some of the writing I think can be tightened up a little bit. I don't know if I think this is an early draft. And so a lot of these are just questions that I think could just be explained a little better in the paper. One of them, so the paper in talking, and by the way, because I don't have a ton of time here, I will not mention all the things I really like about the paper. But one of the strengths of the paper, I think some of these other co-authors, as Doug mentioned, literally wrote the book on meta-analysis. And so they did some really, it's very clear they know their stuff, and they were very thorough, and I appreciate that they mention a lot of these boxes that they check. Like this is, to be rigorous here, to be rigorous here. But one of the things that they mention is, as part of that rigor, is in some of these cases, there were more than 56 studies originally, but some had to be thrown out because they basically used the same data set that somebody else used, and found the same thing, as you might expect, and so they didn't want to double count. And yet when you look at their numbers, so they had, and I'll focus on the 50 profit sharing, they said we have 50 studies that gave us 275 estimates. But then literally you have the exact same data set, and I would expect you find mostly similar results. And so there, it certainly has this flavor of double counting. And of course, they do cluster their standard errors, which is good, but I'm still a little concerned about this idea of double counting, and especially because, at least the way, and again, I'm thinking here from accounting and finance, oftentimes to start with a baseline regression, and it's like, we know this is wrong, but maybe we're using this to compare to prior research or something like that, or let's just see what the effect is without considering the correct controls or things like that. In some cases, I think a lot of the specifications, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but it's kind of for aesthetics. You can't have a table with one column, so let's throw in 5 columns there. And if we're throwing those into the meta-analysis, that could be a little bit troubling. And so a little bit more detail about what, were there only 5.5? Because that actually seems low to me, 5.5 estimates for a paper. Was there a little bit more discretion, throwing out some and keeping others if they seem like they're more relevant? I'll point out here, I think a suggestion, this could actually be a real strength from a methodological contribution, because you can actually look within studies to ask the questions of what is the effect, for example, of controlling for endogeneity. I'll get to that later, but what is the effect of these different research design choices? What they do look at is overall, what is the effect of that? But looking within studies, I think would give you a much clearer interpretation, and that's where the strength of this, multiple estimates per study would really bring to bear here. Okay, so one of the, or I guess from the methodological standpoint, asking this question, overall, does it work? The two main issues, I think, two most interesting issues were they're going to do a better job of tackling the misspecification bias. So some people did a good job of estimating this, and some people did a bad job. Let's just see whether that really makes a big difference. And the other is the publication bias, which we'll talk about next. But in terms of the misspecification bias, so the 2 and the 7 or something different, maybe even more, different dials that they could turn there. The 2 that I thought were most interesting is one is how do you measure what is profit sharing? Because to me, this is a fundamental issue, especially for a firm. It's like, okay, so it works, so what does it look like? What am I actually doing? And what they find is it doesn't matter whether a study measures it in terms of how intense, is it the intensive margin or is it the extensive margin? It's just a dummy variable. So that's surprising to me, but even more so, I don't know how to interpret that, because in order to run this analysis, you have to have comparable estimates. And so, for example, you would not, I just don't even know how to interpret a dummy variable estimate compared to a, this is a continuous measure. Or even if it's a continuous measure, if I scale it by 100, that will have a huge effect on my coefficient, a mechanical effect on the coefficient. And so just need to clarify how that was even done, because I don't know, whatever proportion of these were continuous, I don't even know how that could be combined in the study. And I'm sure there's a good answer to that, just needs to come through in the paper. The other is endogeneity, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but you hear about the endogeneity police. Like, I would say endogeneity is the primary challenge in accounting, finance, economics to really publishing in the top journals and getting the acceptance and recognition for the results that you find. Because it is really, really hard to account for the endogeneity problem. And in the paper, what they say is they have a dummy variable if I can get this right, for any study that attempted in some fashion. And so my natural question is, and there were only, I think, roughly 10% of the studies even attempted in some fashion for this. I would have loved to see a little bit more qualitative analysis. What does that mean? Because it's widely understood that if you do a bad job, and I think we've all seen papers where people use really poor instrumental variables, you can make the endogeneity problem a lot worse. And so this is where it would be helpful to just see, was this a good job? It wasn't a bad job. If it was a bad job, then maybe you want to reconsider what it means and change the way you interpret. And I think that was kind of one of their more interesting takeaways is, whoa, when you control for endogeneity, suddenly the effect is twice as large. Well, again, if they were doing a good job at these, they would have, these papers, that's how you get published in QJE and Journal of Finance and stuff like that. And so if they were not, then some of that may have suggested, this is really hard, maybe impossible. I'm not asking any sort of blame because I also have failed to come up with good instruments in many cases. But it needs a little bit more color on what does it mean to control for that endogeneity. Okay, so the other big one is publication bias. And this is one I had a harder time even understanding and getting my head around this. And I think a lot of this is just explaining what you're trying to do. Some of it, I think, because there is a very large literature in this space, papers and books that have been cited thousands and thousands of times. Some of those were not cited in this paper. And frankly, I don't understand all the nuances there. But what it certainly seemed clear to me is that they have a good test for whether there is publication bias. First, just graphically, you can see that. And again, I think most of us anecdotally would say, of course, there's huge publication bias here. And so what they claim in the paper, what they emphasize, is they're trying to account for that publication bias and adjust for it and coming up with their overall on-average estimate. And so that part there, it's not so clear to me, where I just didn't understand, and maybe it does this, but I couldn't think my way through how their test for whether there is this thing also allows them to adjust for it. So that needs more explanation. But the bigger concern that I had is that what they conclude in the paper, and this, I may have just flatly misunderstood this because I just could not get my head around this. They say that most and perhaps all of the association that they find on average is due to publication bias. And then multiple times, but even though that's a stated, that's an emphasis of their contribution, you only see that in a footnote on page 24 of the paper. And so I may have misunderstood this. I may have just not, I don't know what to make of that. But I think really bringing that up, if that's a contribution. On the other hand, so is that a bad thing if overall we don't find a positive association between profit sharing and productivity? I don't think so. And again, that's why I think this paper is so cool, is because it's, let's just be real here. We don't know exactly what it means in some of these cases to have a profit sharing plan. And we don't expect that it's going to work in all cases. And on average, maybe we wouldn't expect it to work. The point of this paper is to say, where does it work? And so I would actually, I think you have to play that up because you said the contribution. You can't leave that in a footnote at the end of the paper. But to use that as motivation, say, look, we don't see this overall, so let's now go in and see. That said, I also don't, and this is something I'm sure that they have answers for, they just need to say more clearly, how do we think about these moderating effects in light of publication bias? I just have no frame of reference to think about how that, how you can address that. Okay, so to me, the most interesting part of the paper is this focus on contextual factors. I'm going to start, so I'll take these in order, but the first one is unionization, and I think this is a super interesting question. And there's been a lot of work on it, and I think it's an open question. I think it's really important. That said, I don't think this is a strength of the paper. My recommendation would perhaps be to focus more on, say, country differences and frame it around that way. You might still think of unionization as a country difference because they differ across countries. But in this data, I think it's hard to get this question. So first of all, the way it's motivated, early in the paper it said we want to see what is the effect of values and culture, but then they throw in unionization there. as well. And so just either clarifying, how does this fit? Why is this the same as these other? Trust and honesty and individual versus collective perspective, those feel like they fit together, but then the unionization, not so much. And then the data itself, this just needs a little bit more explanation. I couldn't tell if the measure that they have of intensity of unionization is for those firms that actually have profit sharing, or if it's for all of the firms in the sample. And so I think the average study that they looked at had 700 firms, and I suspect, just this is usually the way that Table 1 descriptive statistics look like, it will say for all of the firms in the sample, there were 30% unionization or something like that. But the interpretation is going to be very different. If you look through the way they set up the tension there, they talk about, is this a complement or a substitute? And so the interpretation of the results are going to be very different depending on whether I think that my results are being driven by firms that are themselves unionized and use profit sharing, or if I think these are the firms that, in the presence of a sea of unions, are not unionized. And so it's really critical that you nail that down, and I don't know if that's in the data. It might be, but if it's not, again, I think that's a challenge. And then the third thing is interpretation. Some of this could just be the way it's worded, but in the conclusion it says, unions foster a natural environment of cooperation. Therefore, it makes sense that we see that profit sharing is more likely to work. But as we'll see in a second, what's up with these slides, the way they interpret that is, when it's not natural to cooperate, that's when we expect this to work better. And so these are directly conflicting with each other, which is, I think a natural reason, maybe that's not going to say that, but a good reason to maybe separate those into either different studies, but putting them together just makes that a little bit difficult. Okay, going on to trust and honesty. My first question was, why didn't they use the other world values survey question? Doesn't even say that. I'm not sure what this thing picks up. But there's a measure that says, in general, I think people can be trusted. And that's one that I've seen more commonly in the literature. But that brings just the larger question of what do we think is being picked up here? And so just more discussion on that. Broadly, there are a bunch of different country factors that could matter here that we would expect to be related to productivity and profit sharing and to unions and to all these other things. And so at a minimum, some of these other country factors need to be controlled for. They even say that they mention a couple of them and say we account for all of these, but then they don't, for example, control for GDP or for some of these other things, at least that I can tell. And then, so winding up here, for individualism, again, this I think is a really interesting question of culture, and I think it really dovetails well with this idea of trust, if that's what they're trying to measure. But they make arguments about individual cultures are more self-interested, and so therefore we think incentives will matter more. But then the question is, how do you interpret this? Is that any incentive will matter more? And is the comparison, does profit sharing have this effect compared to no incentive pay, or is it compared to an individual incentive program? And I think that's a really important thing to try to nail down, what you have in mind here, because that has drastically different policy implications, certainly design implications for any given firm. And it reminded me of, and I think this is the challenge that we have to deal with when we're doing meta-analyses, or really, in some level, anytime you're doing a paper with 700 firms and a dummy variable for their implementing this thing, is what is really the comparison group? What is the alternative? And I thought of this. When I was a first-year PhD student, I was eating breakfast and looking at my milk carton, and there was a sticker that said that clinical studies have shown that frosted mini-wheats increase attentiveness by 20%, which is great. And for me, as a PhD student, I could certainly use a little bit more attentiveness. But if you look at the fine print there, and you can't read that, I don't think, any of you, and I think that was by design, because if you do read it, it says 20% higher attentiveness for children in clinical studies who ate mini-wheats compared to children who ate nothing. I think the relevant comparison, I want to know the kids who ate the donuts, the kids who ate oatmeal, and things like that. And I don't think, again, in this study, that's not a fair criticism. You can't do that, but it's really, I think, important, and I think this suggests where are we going next with this. Understanding the environmental factors, but then understanding when we're making a prescription, what do we mean? How do we interpret that prescription? Are we saying profit sharing has this effect compared to, whipping your, the floggings continue until morale improves or whatever, or is it compared to an individual bonus? What is it compared to? And that's a very important question. This is not, I would say, specific to this paper. It's something I think all of us hopefully will be thinking about. How do we really nail down, what is the effect of this compared to a reasonable alternative? So I really enjoyed the paper. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there, especially on the country angle, and I really recommend playing that up. But thanks so much for the opportunity to discuss the paper.
Thank you for your comments. I think I want to give a few minutes for the presenters to respond to their discussants. So why don't we start with Nancy to see if there's anything you want to say in response to your discussants.
Thank you, guys. So the first thing is an oversight on my part is that all of the time and research we put into namely that first round of research was funded by, generously funded by the Kellogg Foundation. So just want to make sure that that's clear. I really appreciate your careful reading of it, and certainly the overall goals are exactly as you kind of laid it out. That my main purpose here is to insert employee ownership into a conversation about wealth inequality, income inequality. And do that in a way that's approachable for kind of a general audience. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to, kind of conduct rigorous analysis and get this in front of academics as well, because in front of the academics, then the academics will teach it, and that gets what I want as well. I would say the one thing that what we do run up against is an N issue, N size issue, that it's going to take these workers getting a little further along in their careers for me to really have enough of an N to start following back over time. So that's the first thing, and I hope to be doing that when they kind of they're going to start hitting their 40s, and we're going to hit some milestones with them. And so absolutely, it's a great idea to make sure that we're using that panel nature. The other thing too, in terms of the wealth, is that they're only asked certain questions when they hit milestones. So they get their household wealth measured when they hit 20, 25, 30, 35, and thereafter. So it's going to be that next set of interviews where I'm going to have enough folks who have hit 30 and 35 to really have a good chunk to look at their wealth. But I totally appreciate comments about linking it up to the well-being, and I take that to heart in terms of that subjective measure of financial condition, because I think that really will enable, if I can kind of dig into that, if I can dig into it and see that it remains even after controlling for income, that there really is something going on when you feel you have a little bit of a nest egg. You really can start to see that effect in your daily life and in being able to have some security and stability. So I think that's it, and I really appreciate you reading it.
Doug, do you have any comments?
I really appreciate Marshall's thoughtful comments here. I think they're just remarkably useful. Just a couple of quick notes about it. The point about possible double counting of studies. Actually, when Marty Weitzman and I did our initial meta-analysis, we decided to take just one estimate per study. We took the median estimate per study so that we wouldn't have any bias like that. In this, it's Patrice and Chris who did who actually run the regressions, and they did a variety of estimates that look at the different types of weighting, inverse weighting for the number of estimates from a study and so forth. So I think that's controlled for, but it's a good point. I think actually it's a really nice point about the endogeneity, that it's endogeneity corrections can go every which direction. Actually, when I was doing my dissertation, Steve Bloom had done one of the classic early ESOP studies, and he tried using some instruments and found a productivity effect of ESOPs of minus 50%, which he regarded as not plausible. I used the same instruments that he did, and I found an effect of plus 50%, which I also regarded as not plausible. So it obviously depends on instruments, and I think it'd be useful to compare the different methods of controlling for endogeneity, and also to do I like the idea of doing a within study, to look within study and see what happens to the coefficients when you control for endogeneity. Doing that kind of comparison would be nice. Let's see. Oh, the effects of publication bias possibly being nonlinear. I think that's right. As you say, t-statistic of 3 versus 10. There may be a very nonlinear effect there. And the World Value Studies measure of trust, I think that'd be a good one to look at. It was these guys who did it, so I'll blame them, but I'll ask them about that. And finally, on the individualism thing, the profit sharing versus no incentive, I think your point is well taken, that we should look at the effects of profit sharing versus the effects of eating donuts. That's one possibility. Yeah. No, seriously, that's a good point.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, now I would like to open up the floor to the 2 questions for our presenters. There's a question here in the back.
Hi. So I have a question about the survey on employee ownership. At what point in time is that a question asked? Is it asked at the beginning of the survey or at the end? And the reason I ask is because people might feel compelled, they feel more satisfied with their job once they have answered their part of an employee-owned firm. Or they might feel they have to say that's a good thing, right? So I wonder if asking it that at the end or varying the moment when that is asked could change people's responses, or at least intensity of the responses, with what are subjective well-being measures at least.
Anyone want to take a stab at it?
A great question. The NLS is humongous. So I don't know where that particular question falls, but I feel very confident that the design is such that it tamps down question wording effects, which it's an important thing to think about. Just because they're going through so much, it's such a long survey. I feel confident in all of those responses, more so than I would be exactly as what you're talking about if it were a short survey. Then I would probably experiment with asking it before and after. But it's a great question.
Next question, and if you could make your way to the front so that we can keep everyone on the microphone, and because I have to give it back to the prisoners as well. Thank you.
So my question is on the perception of employee owner benefit, and I was wondering if it depends upon the point of view of the employee. Typically we see employees transition from being an employee where they work and they get a paycheck we transition to employee ownership and they're an investor and they receive stock. And then at the later ends, they drink the Kool-Aid and they believe in employee ownership and they truly become an employee owner. So I'm just wondering, based on the maturity of the employee within the organization as an employee owner, if you saw anything like that.
I should just clarify, the perception of economic condition was just their general overview of their, had nothing to do with employee ownership. Rick, do you know what I mean? So it'd be great to have other perception questions, but that literally was, everybody got asked, how do you think your overall financial condition is? And what we found there is that employee owners were sizably more likely to feel strongly economically secure. Thanks, Ray.
And the powers that be would like me to just repeat the question. So if you could stand up and ask your question, and then I'll repeat it so that the folks viewing us through live stream can hear the question. That would be great. Are there any other questions for our panelists? So the question is, in terms of economic well-being, are you able to tease out whether or not that translates into other outcomes in terms of divorce, lower rates of divorce, maybe outcomes with children, et cetera?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. What I was thinking as I was hearing the comments too is that what we, assuming that I have enough N to do that, there are health questions in the NLS, just sort of general subjective health measures. So what I'm thinking is that it's possible those subjective economic condition judgments could very well have impacts on variables such as health, such as marriage stability, which all of those things we can review in there. And again, it kind of course, as with any of this kind of research, as we've been talking about, is the kind of the causal arrow, which way does it go? But that's exactly the point, the benefit of the panel data. So what I'm hoping to do when these guys are hitting milestones is what has happened, if we measure marriage as a positive, are there more stable marriages over time because they kind of had that foothold to begin with? Absolutely. They're great issues, Dick. Okay, so the question is
whether or not you've looked at wage gaps of women and people of color, and whether, and if you have, are the wage gaps lower? And when you look at gender, do you see that there's a lower gender gap, especially as it relates to women who have had children? Is there, maybe is there a lower gap in earnings for those individuals who may have suffered a mommy penalty?
Thank you. Yes, so a great question. In the prior report that we did, including the 2013 interviews, I was able to break out, looking just at folks that had an ESOP and not, I was able to break it down to, and again, looking at the wage, the median wages, I was able to show a positive impact for single moms of color. So just wasn't, I'll continue to do that with the adding in the 2015 because it's a great question. And the other thing I noted is that when I looked at those ESOPs in both years, meaning 2015, 2013, and ESOP in neither, that I did see a gender difference. So what I'm hoping to do is dig into that to see, is there something going on where exactly what you're talking about? Because now we're getting women, we're now, you know, in the 30s, mid-30s. What do I see when I look back at those women in 2019? Now, the sort of, to me, the notable counterbalance there is that the workers at ESOP companies are far more likely to have paid maternity leave than not. So how does that kind of play out? But in sort of short answer to your question, yes, these effects, the positive effects of employee ownership continue even looking within gender, race, parental status, but I'll continue to do that even more and more.
Thank you. Yes. So the question is about the quality of the variable measuring ESOP and whether or not you feel confident that that variable is actually measuring an employee stock option plan, or maybe it's measuring employee stock purchasing plan instead of the employee stock ownership plan. And then I'm sorry, repeat the second part of that question. Yeah, I tried to correct it, yeah. Yeah. So the second part of the question, and I tried to correct it in the end, but so whether or not the respondents' first part is whether or not the respondents understand the difference between the employee stock ownership plan and an employee stock option plan or employee stock purchase plan, and then whether or not, how you can tell if the employees have been in the company for 1 year, because you often have to be employed for a year before you have that benefit available to you.
Okay, so I'll start with that first one. My premise as a survey researcher is that if a person is asked a question and they say yes, I trust that person to know what their life is. And because otherwise the premise of survey research is that I'm questioning everything they say. So if I'm not questioning the fact that they say what their income is or what their gender is or what their marital status is, then I'm along for the ride. They look, there's an interviewer right there in front of them, and they look at the page and it says employee stock ownership plan. So I accept that they know what's going on in their life. And therefore if I'm in for a penny, I'm in for a pound. The second thing there is, yes, of course, there's a vesting period, and what the panel data will get me is to answer skeptics like Corey, so that I'll be able to show, yes, there's a certain consistency. When they answered it, they answer it again. And they, you know, if they have paid maternity benefits, I see them take off time for their pregnancy, you know, so those types of things, because it's an absolutely legitimate question. This is an important distinction that I'm making, and it's based on them answering one question. But I think that one, I have faith in folks answering questions very, very seriously and taking the time to answer them and know what they're doing. But I'm also benefiting from the fact that it's a panel, and so that I can kind of see. And I think the panel nature also speaks to the vesting issue, because over time I am going to get folks where, well, right now, even in my 2013, there's a certain portion that have said yes for 2, 3, 4 years. I just don't have a big enough group of them yet to be able to speak to we can set aside the vesting issue because all of my folks in 2013 have had it in 2011. Or all of my folks that are going to show up in 2019 have said, yes, I have it, 2015, 2013, 2011, 2010. So no, of course not perfect, but I do feel confident. Oh, sure.
If I could add just one comment on that, I think that's an interesting question of what people are thinking about when they see employee stock ownership plan. And to some extent, it's going to be an over-inclusive measure. You're going to get some people who get stock options or they bought stock in the company and so forth. To some extent, that's not a big problem if you're measuring employee ownership more generally. You're not looking just at ESOPs, you're looking at employee ownership more generally. That's still interesting. It does raise a question if it is, say, a stock purchase plan and the person voluntarily decided to purchase stock that year. So there could be different dynamics going on. But again, I don't think it's a big problem if this is an ESOP plus measure as opposed to just a pure ESOP measure, as long as we're measuring employee ownership in some form.
Thank you, Doug, for the final comments. I believe we have a research update, so if we could roll the video if it's ready.
Into this survey. It's going to be the largest organization level survey on employee ownership in the United States. Hi folks, this is Fidan Kurtulis at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I just wanted to give you a quick research update on a relatively new research project. We are introducing an employee ownership module into the 2020 wave of the Census Bureau's annual survey of manufacturers, management and organizational practices survey. So we're going to be including a set of questions on broad-based employee share ownership into this survey. It's going to be the largest organization-level survey on employee ownership in the United States. It's going to be asked to all large establishments in the manufacturing industry in the United States. Because this is a Census Bureau survey, firms are obliged to respond. So that's a really great thing because we're going to reduce the amount of non-response involved in this data collection effort. We've been in discussion with high-level officials at the Census Bureau who are very excited about the inclusion of these employee ownership questions into the ASM 2020. And we're partnering with Mathematica to help us with pilot testing of the survey questions and grant funding proposals to various agencies. So I just wanted to give you a quick update of all this. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes our session on empirical research on employee share ownership. Thank you for joining the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing for this presentation.